In the dark woods of northern England, nestled among the hills of Northumberland, there stood a small stone cottage. The year was 1577, and the air was thick with the scent of decay as winter's chill crept through the land. Within this unassuming home lived Henry Blackwood, a man feared by those who knew him. He was a man whose soul had long been consumed by darkness, a darkness that would stretch across continents and centuries. Henry Blackwood was not born evil, but something within him snapped in his 30th year. The villagers whispered of strange occurrences, animals found slaughtered, the earth soaked in blood, and screams that echoed through the night. No one dared confront him, for there was something unsettling in his eyes, something that hinted at the horrors he harbored deep within. One fateful night, a traveler sought refuge from the cold and found himself at Blackwood's door. Henry welcomed him in, offering warmth and food. But as the traveler slept, Henry's mind twisted with malevolence. In the dark of night, he crept upon his guest and, with a sharpened blade, ended the man's life. It was a brutal act, the first of many, as Henry found a perverse satisfaction in the power of taking a life. That night, the Blackwood bloodline was cursed. Unbeknownst to Henry, the spirit of the traveler, a Romani man with knowledge of ancient curses, lingered. As his blood seeped into the ground, the spirit cast a curse on Henry and his descendants, a curse that would drive them to kill, generation after generation, for 4 centuries. The Blackwood curse carried on through Henry's son, Thomas, who, like his father, was gripped by an uncontrollable urge to kill. The family relocated to Scotland in the early 1600s, seeking to escape the suspicions of the English villagers. But the curse followed them. Thomas Blackwood became known as the Butcher of Inverness after a string of gruesome murders left the town in terror. Women and children were found mutilated in the forest, their bodies arranged in grotesque displays. Each killing was more savage than the last, as Thomas descended further into madness. The townspeople eventually caught him, and he was hanged in 1632. But before he died, he swore that his bloodline would continue its dark legacy. And it did. Thomas's son, Robert, fled to France, changing his name to Robert du Noir to escape the family's infamous reputation. But the bloodlust did not diminish with distance. Robert's urge to kill was just as strong, and soon the streets of Paris ran red with the blood of his victims. By the mid-1600s, Robert had become a notorious figure in the French underworld, feared by all who crossed his path. The curse was relentless, consuming each new generation. In 1680, Robert's grandson, Philippe du Noir, took the Blackwood curse to the Americas. He settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, just as whispers of witchcraft began to circulate. Philippe took advantage of the hysteria, using the fear of the supernatural to cover his tracks. Women accused of witchcraft would disappear, only to be found later, their bodies desecrated in ways that seemed to confirm the worst fears of the Puritan community. Philippe was never caught, but the stories of his deeds became part of the dark folklore of New England. As the years turned into centuries, the Blackwood bloodline spread across the world, each new generation carrying the curse to new lands. In the 1700s, Philippe's grandson, William Blackwood, found himself in the Caribbean, where piracy was rife. He became a pirate, his name striking fear into the hearts of those who sailed the Atlantic. William's ship, the Shadow's Blade, was a vessel of terror, where prisoners were tortured and killed in the most gruesome ways imaginable. William's cruelty knew no bounds. He reveled in the pain of others, taking pleasure in the screams of his victims. The Blackwood curse had turned him into a monster of the seas, and his infamy spread far and wide. But like those before him, William met a violent end. In 1754, during a fierce battle with a British naval ship, William was captured and hanged. His last words were a chilling promise that the Blackwood legacy would never die. In the 19th century, the curse found its way to the Australian outback. Thomas Blackwood, a distant relative of William, had emigrated to Australia in search of a new life. But the curse was as strong as ever. Thomas became known as the Outback Ripper, a killer who stalked the remote towns and settlements of the Australian wilderness. His victims were left in the harsh desert sun, their bodies torn apart by wild animals, a fitting end for those who crossed paths with a Blackwood. The Blackwood name became synonymous with death and horror. In the late 1800s, Thomas's son, Samuel Blackwood, moved to South Africa during the Diamond Rush. The bloodlust followed him, and soon the mining camps were plagued by mysterious disappearances. Workers were found with their throats slit, their bodies mutilated, as if some wild beast had torn them apart. But the locals knew better. They whispered of the Blackwood curse, of a man who killed for the sheer pleasure of it. By the 20th century, the Blackwood family had settled in the United States once again, this time in the small town of Cold Creek, Montana. The year was 1901, and the town was a quiet place, nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. It was here that John Blackwood, the latest in the cursed line, tried to live a normal life. But the curse would not let him rest. John was a respected member of the community, a man of few words who kept to himself. But beneath his calm exterior lay the same darkness that had consumed his ancestors. In the winter of 1927, the curse resurfaced with a vengeance. Cold Creek was hit by a series of brutal murders, each more gruesome than the last. Women were found strangled, their bodies hidden in the dense woods surrounding the town. The killings continued for months, and the townspeople lived in fear, not knowing that the killer was one of their own. John Blackwood was never caught. He died in 1932, taking his dark secret to the grave. But the curse lived on, passing to his son, Edward. By the 1950s, Edward had moved to the bustling city of Chicago, where he tried to escape the family's violent past. But the bloodlust was too strong. Edward became known as the Chicago Butcher, a killer who terrorized the city for nearly a decade. His victims were often young women, lured by his charm and good looks, only to be brutally murdered in the privacy of his home. Edward was meticulous, leaving no evidence behind. But in 1961, after a botched attempt to dispose of a body, he was finally caught. The trial that followed captivated the nation, and Edward was sentenced to death. He was executed in 1963, but the curse did not die with him. Edward's son, Michael Blackwood, was the last of the cursed line. By the 1970s, the Blackwood family had become a shadow of its former self. Michael grew up in a small town in Oregon, unaware of the dark legacy that hung over his family. But as he entered adulthood, the curse began to awaken within him. Michael tried to fight it, but the bloodlust was overwhelming. In the winter of 1977, the curse reached its peak. Michael became a killer, just like his ancestors before him. The town of Silverton was gripped by fear as a series of brutal murders rocked the community. The killings were savage, the work of a man who had lost all sense of humanity. But unlike his ancestors, Michael did not revel in the killings. He was tormented by the curse, driven to madness by the voices that haunted him, the voices of the Blackwoods who had come before him. In a final act of desperation, Michael took his own life, hoping to end the curse once and for all. The year was 1977, and the Blackwood curse had finally come to an end. For 400 years, the bloodline had been tainted by darkness, each generation driven to kill by a force beyond their control. But with Michael's death, the curse was broken, and the Blackwood name was lost to history. The towns and cities that had been touched by the Blackwood's darkness slowly healed, the memories of the horrors they had wrought fading with time. But the stories lived on, passed down through generations as warnings of the dangers that lurk within the human soul. And in a quiet corner of the world, in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, a small graveyard holds the final resting place of Michael Blackwood. The headstone is simple, marked only with his name and the years of his life. But beneath the cold earth lies the vestige of a curse that spanned 4 centuries, a curse that brought death and destruction to all who crossed its path. Earth and carved stone shadowed by the small figure of a woman holding a small child.